MCP is absolutely not dead. It's actually getting a lot of updates. There's a lot of companies improving their MCP servers. In fact, Chrome actually came out here with a pretty significant update to the Chrome DevTools MCP, which allows your agent, this can be Claude Code or Codex or GitHub Copilot, or to essentially access your signed in browser session so that it can debug your live browser session. So you can reuse an existing browser session. So if you want your coding agent to fix an issue that is gated behind sign-in, for example, your coding agent can now directly access your current browsing session, not requiring an additional sign-in. Or when you discover a failing network request in the Chrome DevTools network panel, you can select it and then ask your agent to investigate it. It also works with elements selected in the Elements panel. We've also seen that OpenAI and Figma have an integration now here where the Figma MCP server connects Codex directly to its design platform. So of course, as a developer, you're constantly working with design files from your designers. And yeah, the Figma MCP server can really help you out. There's a bunch of other MCP related things as well, like Web MCP, that I think you should really know about. We'll talk about this in the video as well. This is a little bit different, but it still deserves a mention. So basically in this video, I want to go through the top MCP servers that really deserve your attention as a developer. Maybe you're already using some of them. Maybe you were already curious about some of them, you just haven't gotten around to it. In this video, we'll go through them pretty quickly one by one, because a lot of people are just using their agent to basically just chat and ask improvements to the code base directly. But there's actually a bigger productivity jump if it can access other things that you are already using, like your design files or your actual repo on GitHub or the tickets, pull requests, the most up-to-date documentation for the tech stack that you're using, your browser session, maybe do some automated testing even. And sometimes actually it needs to go onto the web because it's not in the documentation. You actually want it to search on the web more generally because the answer may be out there. So you may actually want to give it access to the live web as well. And maybe you're already using some services and you didn't even know that they had an MCP server. So there's actually more than 10,000 MCP servers. So let's go through the top ones that I identified and see if we can improve your MCP stack. Now, very quickly, by the way, Permit has just launched their MCP Gateway. Yes, they're also today's sponsor. And actually, this fits in really nicely in your MCP stack to take care of the authorization, right? So who should have access to which MCP servers and which tools. We'll talk more about this later in the video. But if you're already curious, you can find a link in the description. All right, let's start with the first one, which is actually the Figma MCP server. So in Figma, if I have some design, or maybe you created it, or one of your designers on your team created it, I have all of these elements here. There's a bunch of design information here, the colors, all the design system information here. So if this needs to be turned into actual code, right? So here I have an application. I want to change this application to match. I want this application to become this dashboard design. Previously it was a major hassle, but now this is much easier thanks to the Figma MCP server. And so with this enabled, your coding agent can generate code from that selected frame. It can extract design context, so variables, components, layout data. So here we can connect with Figma MCP in two ways. So the remote MCP server, with MCP servers, this is typically when the service that you're using already has your data or basically the useful things. But sometimes the MCP server runs locally because it needs to do things, useful things on your own computer. Right? Something like Playwright, for example, or Puppeteer, you're doing it on your own computer. And so you may want to have a local MCP server. Now Figma has a desktop application, so the useful data is on your own computer. And so there is a desktop MCP server for that. However, in my case here, I'm just using the web app they have. And so it's a remote MCP server. Okay, so then if we go down here, let's see. I'm going to use Claude Code in this video, but it all works very similar for the other coding agents you may have. So here they recommend how to install it. They actually have a plugin for this. So this is a bit different from the manual setup. So the manual setup, if I copied that, if I would do it manually, right, just to show you here, I could go to my terminal somewhere. I have my app running here. I could open up a new terminal and I could paste this in here, right? So here I would have this command here to add an MCP server to Claude Code, right? So I'm using Claude Code here. From my understanding, it's not possible to do this yet in the actual extension, right? So I like to use this extension of Claude Code here in the code editor. You can find that here in Visual Studio Code under extensions and to actually chat with Claude Code. But to add an MCP server, I will use the terminal here. This is one way to do it, but you only get the MCP server. So I think this is why they're using the plugin method here with Claude Code, because this will include the MCP server, but also skills. So there is basically some additional context that will explain to your coding agent how to convert a design into code. Dealing with design system rules, there's some additional context packaged up in skills that it can give your coding agent with this. So I will use their provert method here. So let me remove this and let's see what we get if I press enter here. Okay, so successfully installed. So now if I do Claude /MCP, I need to give access to this workspace. Yes, I trust this folder. And it shows me the MCP servers that I currently have enabled. So there's a bunch of other ones that I have already installed before, but now you can see there is this plugin Figma, which still needs authentication. So with remote MCPs, you do need often to authenticate yourself. So if I press enter here, we will go through an authentication flow because of course, not everybody can just access my resources in Figma, right? So I need to prove that I'm actually, I'm actually this user here in Figma. Okay, so I will go and allow access and now it looks good. Authentication successful. I can return authentication successful connected here. And now when I type /skills, I can see the skills that have come with this plugin as well. So Figma includes some code connect skill, basically so skills are just some information about how the agent should do certain things. Create design system rules, but here also implement design, right? So now let's actually try that out. So I should be able to right click on a frame and then here there is copy link to selection. And my guess is actually we can take the URL from the URL bar as well. All right, so now if I use Claude Code, I can type Claude and I can say implement this design into code. This whole app needs to become this design. Now it should automatically pick up on the fact that it needs that skill and it should load that skill into its context here, into the context of the conversation. And we should be able to see that. Otherwise we can manually ask it to read that skill, but let's see what it can do with this. Okay, so yes, so skill, successfully loaded skill. That's very good. Right, implement design skill, that's correct. All right, so actually I'm getting an issue here. It says enable the MCP server and restart Claude Code. So I will do /MCP one more time to check. And looks like I need authentication again. So let's go through it one more time. I'm already logged into figma.com. So I should be able to just click one button here. And now it looks like it went successfully. So I'm gonna press up arrow key and try this again. So there is one failed server here, but that's a different server. That's some other server I was playing around with. All right, so now we can see here, let's see, trying to invoke a tool, right? So an MCP server gives an agent access to so-called tools. That's why some other things as well, but this is the meat of it. Right, so these AI models, they're trained on invoking tools, tool calling. So one of the tools that the Figma MCP server offers is the get design context tool. And here it actually asks us for permission before calling that tool. So there's some information about the tool. This tool, if you call it or the coding agent calls it, it will get the design context for a Figma node. There's some more information. Do we want to allow the coding agent, Claude Code here, to actually call that tool? I can say yes, but I actually want it to not ask me again because it interrupts my workflow. So I will press 2. Okay, so let's see what we get here. So it has called the tool and it's giving us a warning. It's a large MCP response. This can fill up the context quickly. Okay, that's okay. So in this skill that should become part of the conversation context that you have with your coding agent, it talks about translating to project conventions. So it's already saying that the output should match with the project framework and styles and conventions, right? And replace Tailwind utility classes with the project's preferred utilities or design system tokens, reuse existing components, right? So when you ask your agent to implement a design, this should already be part of the skill that is included. So we should not have to add this again to our prompt, right? So we should not, right? We should be able to just say, here's a design, implement it. And it should pick up on the fact that it should load the skill into the context by itself, which already has a bunch of those instructions included. So we should be able to leave that out in our actual user prompt. All right, so also I will allow all edits. All right, and after a few minutes, it says the build is clean. Let's check it out. And here we go. I have this complete dashboard here now implemented in my actual app here. And if we compare this with the original here in the design, it matches very closely with the actual design itself. So It's just amazing. In the past, you had to share a bunch of screenshots, and it was just a major hassle also with all the design tokens and such. So I think it's really amazing how much this improves your workflow related to design. So I think this is a must-have MCP server if you are dealing with Figma in any way as a developer. All right, so next one, sticking to the design theme, is actually Paper MCP. So this is a bit of a new tool. It's been going viral and a lot of people are using it with Claude Code and looks really interesting. And it's more designed for shipping with agents. So there is a desktop application. So I opened up the desktop app, and this is a canvas that you're used to, but it has pretty powerful MCP capabilities here. So if we connect this to Claude Code, so here they describe Paper MCP server. So you do need the desktop application. And then here for Claude Code, they have this command, right? So this is actually a local MCP server, right? So sort of, right, because the data now lives on my computer in a desktop app. So now if I just exit out of here, if I clear this out, and if I add this MCP server, we now should be able to do things in that canvas with our agent. So if I go into Claude again, actually if I type /MCP, we should be able to see Paper here, right? So here we have a user MCP, which is Paper. Okay, so now if I say bring this dashboard app into Paper, let's actually see what it can do with that. So it's gonna read the files. Now it wants to run a Paper tool. So Paper get basic info, right? So MCP server contributes these tools, and it wants get basic info. I will allow that, and the other one as well. Now it wants to create an artboard in Paper. Okay, so I'm gonna allow that. If I check out the desktop app at the moment, you can see it's already working, right? So you can see it has created this artboard here, and there is things going on because we see this progress, this loading indicator here. Of course, I'm running Claude Code here in Visual Studio Code. I can bring the terminal out here and view it side by side. And you can see Paper write HTML. So Paper actually uses simple HTML and CSS to draw things here on the canvas, which is really interesting. And now you can see things are already appearing here. This actually looks very similar to our actual live dashboard here in code. So let's see what else it can do here. All right, so it's drawing the rest of the dashboard. And I think it's really cool that we're able to bring our live code apps from here into design here with just one prompt to our coding agent and actually see it be updated live. All right, so some more content coming, right? And I can zoom in and out. I can click here. We have all of these design options. I will not try to move it as it's working, but you can see we can already start changing things here, change the text and such, right? So all the time it's just writing HTML. All right, so it wants to get a screenshot. We will allow that. All right, it actually wants to update the styles, so maybe it didn't like something. So now I have my app, my live app in the canvas here in the design. So now I could ask something like, can you create a layout variation of the dashboard in Paper? All right, so after a few minutes, it actually created a really good looking variation of my dashboard here. Actually, I prefer this version over what we have here. So now I would actually like to bring this back into code again. So I can ask Claude Code, make this app the new variation you just designed. All right, so currently I still have this old dashboard. All right, so after 2 minutes or so, it's finished. It was pretty fast actually. And here we go. I now have that new variation that we have here in the canvas implemented in code with the Paper MCP and Claude Code. So really interesting workflow here. Maybe bring in some external data from Notion or something like that to make your designs feel realistic. And then you can implement it back and forth in your code and in the infinite canvas. So really interesting MCP server as well. The third one and final design related MCP is actually Pencil. So this also is a new one that you can use, and it works a little bit differently. So we need to install it as an ID extension, because what you're going to get is a canvas inside your ID. So if we search for Pencil, here we should be able to install this. All right. So now what you can do is create so-called pen files. So I can say, well, just test.pen. And when I do that, the extension should be able to pick up on that. All right, and if I go to the pencil icon here in the sidebar, after a few minutes, it started showing this welcome screen here. So we have a couple of different pen files, and we do need to go through the onboarding here. So I will do that now. All right, so this MCP should work out of the box when you install Pencil. So here we have a setup here. So we have a prompt, turn the step 1 frame into dark mode, but I don't see run. I do see copy here. So my guess is that we can paste this in here. So I'm actually going to restart Claude Code here just to make sure it picks up on that MCP. If I search for MCP, we see Pencil here is indeed part of it. I actually just closed Paper, so then it cannot connect anymore. But Pencil, the one I'm looking at right now, is connected out of the box. It does not need a separate install. Okay, so if I paste that prompt, let's see what it can do, right? So this is a frame. So this is also an infinite canvas inside your ID. Let me close the sidebar here. And you can see now it's using tools from the Pencil MCP server. So it's saying batch get and get editor state. Okay, and I can see that, okay, so this is the step one. So actually you can see it, the file has been changed. So really interesting, completely different than maybe what you've seen. So Pencil works inside your own ID. I believe they have a desktop application as well, but I've seen it around. You can get a very tight feedback cycle because you don't have to switch between different apps. You can stay inside your ID. And it has a lot of the design features that you expect here on an infinite canvas. And let's actually try one more. There's another example here. Add 3 more rows to the step 2 frame. So the step 2 frame is below here. So we can just prompt for that if we want to change something. So it should add 3 more rows now. All right, so after some time, we can see there are more rows available now. So really interesting tool as well. So we are creating these pen files and yeah, really impressive actually that we can do this. So really excited to see where these tools are going. But part of our MCP stack is not only the MCP servers themselves, we also need to take a look at the authentication, authorization issue surrounding these MCP servers. Coding agent, let's say Claude Code, you're going to connect that with a bunch of MCP servers, right? So these tools, right? So these MCP servers expose tools, and that's the whole reason why we connect them. So there could be a get invoice tool or delete invoice tool that some MCP server is contributing. So this is actually a little bit risky because maybe we don't want to give our agent access to a delete tool because typically we're a little bit worried about losing data, right? So typically getting data, retrieving data is a little bit safer, but still requires some thought around who should have access. But especially things that update data or delete data, we typically have a little bit more concern around. There is a whole authentication authorization story that you should not underestimate, that you should also take care of when you're architecting your MCP stack. So I actually want to introduce you to Permit. They're sponsoring the video, of course. I've actually worked with them in the past as well, because they have just launched their Permit MCP Gateway. As of recording, you can upvote them here on Product Hunt as well. But it's live now, you can find it here. And this helps you out with that whole authentication authorization story here. So the idea here is that instead of connecting directly to these MCP servers, you're going to do it through their gateway, right? So it's going to go through the MCP Gateway, and as I'll show you in a second, we can import these MCP servers. It can detect the tools that are part of that MCP server so that you can configure what trust level is required for a tool like that. So then when I try to use Claude Code, I need to authenticate myself and I need to set a trust level so that I can decide which tools should be accessible for my agent. And you don't have to do much setup actually. Right, so this is a drop-in trust layer for MCP. Right? It deals with authentication, fine-grained authorization, consent, and auditing as well. Right? So we want to have an audit trail because let's say I am trying to do something. I'm trying to use the delete invoice tool, but I do not have the required trust level for that. Well, it should be rejected in that case. So you have some kind of policy that decides what kind of permissions we should have. And we want to have a history of that. We want to audit that. We want to have a clear overview of what happened. Right? I actually did another video with Permit on authorization fundamentals, right? RBAC and ABAC, even something called REBAC. And actually a lot of the fundamentals are the same. So typically there is some kind of user or a role like an editor, and they have a permission to on a particular resource. Right? So it's always about some kind of role or user that has some kind of action, that has an action on a particular resource. If you want a complete video on that, check out this video I did with Permit. Explains the fundamentals of authorization really well. And I would say a lot of the fundamentals are the same because an MCP server is not that different from, let's say, an API server. You may have some API endpoint where the user can delete invoices. typically you have some logic surrounding authentication, authorization, to check if the user is actually allowed to do that, right? With an MCP server, that doesn't change, right? We still have our resources, and we still want to allow or deny a certain entity to do an action on those. I will continue with the list now, but if you're already interested in checking it out, check out the link in the description. Okay, and I will show you a bit later how to actually set it up, including with a custom MCP, so your own MCP server. We'll talk more about this later. Make sure you watch all the way to the end. All right, so moving on from pure design into more, let's say, front-end UI is actually the Shadcn UI MCP. So Shadcn UI is something that you've probably seen before. It has all of these wonderful components built on Radix or base UI, and those components have a lot of accessibility built in, right? So here the focus is trapped. If I press tab, it's inside the dialog here. It does not leak into the background here, right? So tons of accessibility details like that. It has really nice base design as well. In fact, they just added this create page where we can quickly find the styles that we like and use that as a preset. So it has become really popular. So if you want to use that in your project, you can just ask your coding agent, of course. It probably has some knowledge about Shadcn, so you don't necessarily need a dedicated MCP server just for it to do perhaps some basic things with MCP with Shadcn. But with the Shadcn MCP server, we do give it some structured access to the components that are part of Shadcn, the blocks or other templates. So for an important part of your tech stack, like your design system or your component library, it probably is worth it to add the MCP server for that. The agent will then be able to properly browse the available components, both from Shadcn itself as well as from the other component registries actually. So it's not only Shadcn UI, there's also these other component libraries like these AI elements. So these are components that are really wonderful if you're building some kind of AI chat application. There are some components specifically tailored towards that. So you may actually want to give your agent the ability to browse those as well. In fact, you may want to switch your app from using some components from one library to another one. So if we can give it structured access to information about that, I think that's worth it. So if I install this, here on the website they show that I have to run this command, right? Because here, for example, if I look at how my app is now implemented, it's all just a bunch of, well, hard-coded markup here, HTML basically. Right, so instead we probably want to use a more professional component library that has all sorts of little details taken care of. So I can install the Shadcn MCP server for this project. Let's go ahead, configuring MCP server. All right, so now this is good to go. Now if I do Claude /MCP, it has found this MCP server, and it also shows that here the Shadcn is a project MCP. In fact, if I click on that, we can see the tools that this MCP server contributes. So it has the project registries, the items that are part of that, and some examples as well. So now I can say something like convert this dashboard app into using proper Shadcn components. It's actually quite a realistic workflow because typically it's a little bit tricky to work with Shadcn in the design phase. So typically during the coding stage, you have to clean up some of the more hard-coded HTML markup type of code from translating the design into an app. And so we may want to give it a pass here with Shadcn. We can see it's already starting to call a tool here, get project registries, and then it's getting the add command for items, basically the command that you need to run to add a specific component, for example. So then the agent knows which command to run to do that. Right, simple things like that can actually already help out. All right, and after a few minutes, we can see that it has used the Shadcn components. It actually gives a nice overview here of which ones. If I check out the code, we can indeed see that there are now more of these components, right? Button, an icon, calendar, a card component. And with Shadcn, it's always this components folder. So now if you take a look, we can see the project looks almost the exact same, but many of these components now should be coming from Shadcn. All right, so the next one is also a bit similar in the sense that it also allows you to get additional context essentially about the libraries or packages or anything or other things in your tech stack that you're using. So this is a very popular one, Context7 MCP. It allows your agent to get the latest documentation and examples. So these AI models, they're trained on some older data, and with code, it's really important that it's using the latest, well, examples from the documentation and such. So for example, if I have a next question for my agent, it can get the latest information about Next.js, from Context7. Not just for Next.js, but all of these other libraries as well. You can see it's tens of thousands of libraries whose documentation you can give your agent access to by just installing this one MCP server. Now, there are some best practices here, right? So without Context7, you may get code examples on old training data, or it may hallucinate APIs that don't even exist, or some generic answers from old package versions. Now with Context7, your agent can get up-to-date information. Okay. Now here they mention that you can add, if you have a prompt, that you can add use Context7. So basically motivating the agent to actually use the Context7 MCP. But you can also add a rule to your Claude.md, right? So I can create a file Claude.md in my project here, and I can say something like use Context7 MCP for API docs examples, something like this. So then when you have an actual prompt here with Claude, it will actually use the Context7 MCP. But if we use the latest installation recommendation here, it actually should install a skill with that. And that skill should already do that for us. So we should be able to just run this command and install all of that, just like we had a plugin before with Figma. Now we should be able to just run this. So let's try doing that. And it will walk you through setting this up, including setting up an API key. So here we want an MCP server. We are doing this for Claude Code. And here we can log in because you do need an API key because they were probably getting a bunch of requests. All right, so I just logged in and now we should be able to go back and see that this has been configured with an API key and a rule has been installed. Actually, it does install it in a rules file, but it also installs a skill, and that also should have information about that. So here, if I open up the skill, we can see the skill should be used when the user asks about libraries, frameworks, API references, or needs code examples. Activates for setup, so when you have a setup question, or code generation when it involves some library, or when it mentions a specific framework like React, Vue, Next.js, Prisma, Supabase. So now if I start Claude Code, I can ask something like check if this project is using the latest Next.js properly. Something like this, just to see if it can invoke a tool from the Context7 MCP server. So here you can see now, it wants to use the Context7 tool resolve library ID. So it needs to know an ID of the library that it needs to get the docs from, that it needs to get the information from. And then the second step is to actually get the information. So it's typically two tools here that it uses. And I will allow this. And notice, by the way, that it was able to call this tool without me having to specify use Context7, right? So it's able to pick up on the fact that it should use tools from that MCP server. Okay, so here we see this is the latest stable release. So there is a minor issue here with inconsistent font usage. Use client on the root page. So that's probably something that counters the examples that it saw from Next.js, right? Or it could be one of the reasons. If you already know the library ID that you want to use, you can actually just add that to your prompt. So it saves the tool call. And if you want to have a specific version, you can just mention that in your prompt as well. So I think that's a great MCP server. I use it in pretty much all my coding agents. It's the first one I install. So yeah, great addition to your MCP stack, I think. All right, another one that I think is a must-have, which is, of course, the GitHub MCP server. And maybe your company is not using GitHub for their repos, but maybe it's some other service. They'll probably have some kind of similar MCP. Right, so with Context7, you basically get context about other external libraries and projects. But of course, your own projects or the projects inside your own company also have a bunch of context and history and things to know about. So this is where the GitHub MCP can really help you out. So you can ask, for example, explain the architecture of some repo that is on GitHub, right? Great for onboarding, for example, right? Or maybe in the pull request, something went wrong, or you want to check if there's something risky with authentication. So you can check what changed in this pull request that could break auth. We need to review something and you just want to draft a comment for one of the concerns that people could have about the code changes. Right, maybe somebody submitted a bug report and it wasn't particularly easy to understand, so you can just ask your coding agent. Maybe something in your workflow like deploying or builds are failing on GitHub with your project, so you can ask it to take a look at that. And even some security related questions you may have, so you could do something like this. So really lots of use cases, I think, for the GitHub MCP fits in really smoothly in your workflows. So let's see how we can install it for Claude Code. So they have some guides here for the different coding agents for Claude Code. So for Claude Code, that is this one. So we need to run the following command in the terminal itself. That's not in the Claude code CLI, so that's before you write Claude. So if I clear this out, it's right now I'm actually in the terminal. Now it does need a so-called personal access token, right? Which makes sense because we may access sensitive data in our GitHub account, like a private repo. Not everybody should just be able to access that. So we need to prove that we have access to that. So we need to generate a personal access token. So if you click on here, you will see that you go to developer settings. You can also find it yourself by going to settings here. And then if you scroll down all the way at the bottom, you'll see developer settings. And then here you have personal access tokens. So I will just say this one is for YouTube tutorial. I like to keep it short here, and we can give it access to specific repositories and then the actual permissions. But because we already picked repository access here, I think we don't need anything from that for now. So I can generate a token. So then, of course, we can paste it in here. Make sure you don't show it to anyone else. I will paste it here and then press enter. All right, so I pressed enter there. Now if I check Claude's MCP servers, let's check it out. So now we can see here all the way at the top, we can see GitHub is connected here. In Claude, if I open up Claude, I should be able to ask questions about, well, public repos. Can you find my latest public repo on GitHub? So it wants to use a tool from the GitHub MCP server. It needs to know who I am. So let's gonna call a tool for that. And then it wants to search my repositories. I will allow that. We also see the results, by the way, from the tool call. So there's actually 36 results from searching something here. And we can see there is one public. And so here now we get the result, GitHub specific workflows with my AI agent, right? So we do want to take care of that authorization story. And I think this permit MCP Gateway can really help you out with that. And it works with the MCP servers that you're already using. You don't really have to change your existing setup either. So here's a nice graphic here. So we have an MCP client, and I'm using Claude Code in the video, but of course you can have any of the other ones, including background agents these days, but also personal AI assistants like OpenClaw. It's basically an agent as well. And you want to give them access to your data, to, well, these services, the data that's living somewhere else. Right, these can be third-party MCP servers, but you can also have your own MCP servers. And of course, we want to take care of the trust element in that type of interaction. So there's some authentication, authorization logic, and of course, auditing as well. So what you get is every tool call is checked against your policies, right? So with authorization, you have a policy when the permissions, and those can be auto-generated actually as it's importing the MCP server. So it supports RBAC, ABAC, REBAC, and you can pick your model. And it's actually pretty easy to get started. You don't have to install an SDK. You don't have to change your agents or change MCP servers. You just add the MCP servers. It will auto-generate some policies. You can find a link in the description. Let's move on to automation in the browser. So I actually want to show you the Playwright MCP so that we can do things automatically with our coding agent, things that we want to do in the browser. This can be filling out a login form, submitting a form, clicking on things, doing certain actions, so we can, for example, check or test if everything is working as expected. So we can do that with Playwright. Now, Playwright itself is actually a testing framework, but there is actually this Playwright MCP server as well, so that we can give our agent browser automation capabilities. So if we scroll down, it shows the installation here. So I will just copy this. I will exit out of Claude here just in my terminal. Okay, so now if we do Claude/MCP, we see Playwright here at the top connected. If I press enter, let's check out the tools. So it can close the browser, resize browser window, get a console message, really helpful for debugging errors, for example. It can fill out a form. Let's see, type text, go back, navigate to a URL, list the network requests. Also very useful if you have some network requests not really responding properly. So it can take a screenshot, it can click, it can drag, hover, and so on, right? So a lot of things that you would manually have to do before to check if something worked can be done automatically. All right, so we still have our dashboard app here running on localhost 3000. So now if we ask Claude, open up my local app at that location and do a quick smoke test, just to see if it can work. So it should pick up on the fact that it can use Playwright MCP for that. So now indeed it wants to use the navigate to a URL tool, and we will allow that, of course. All right, so here we go. This is all Claude Code or Playwright MCP. This window here, I'm not controlling that. There's not that much it can do, by the way. We haven't really made the app functional at this point, but it is able to open up the window and navigate to it and such. So it wants to take a screenshot. I will allow that. And let me actually put it side by side. So we can also ask it to interact. Like, let's say it should click on this bar option here in the revenue overview. So we can say click on the bar option in the revenue overview. Let's see if it can do that. So it wants to use the click tool. It has a reference to a particular element. So let's say, yes, it's allowed, and immediately it executes the tool. And so it actually clicked the bar, and we can see that here in the preview. Right, so if you're running into some bug and you have your console errors here, you can just ask it, check out the console errors, right? Or if you have issues with the network requests, you can ask it about network requests. But it opens up a separate window here. So this is not using my existing window here. There should be a way that we could make something like that work. But for now, this is what I wanted to show you with Playwright MCP, right? So if you want to test some kind of user flow or reproduce some bug that somebody is reporting, or you want to give your agent easy access to things like the console errors and such, this is a great MCP server in my view. So of course, the next one I want to show you is the Chrome DevTools MCP. It's gotten some attention in the past few days because we should be able to easily connect it to your existing browser windows. So if you're already logged into a particular app, for example, it should be able to keep using that. So it does have a lot of overlap with the Playwright MCP. So we can get performance insights. So it uses the Chrome DevTools to record traces and it extracts insights from that. It has advanced browser debugging. So it analyzes network requests. It can take screenshots and it can do automation as well, but it's using Puppeteer under the hood. So if we scroll down, we can see that here we have the Cloud Code CLI, but it says that's MCP only. There's also a plugin, so then you get the MCP and skills, which is typically preferred. So I need to do plugin marketplace add that one, okay? And then we can install the actual plugin. So this is all in the Cloud instance, by the way, not in my terminal. Okay, so here it's a plugin, Chrome DevTools MCP, install for you, I will install. And then it says restart Claude Code to have the MCP server and skill load. Okay, so I'm just gonna clear out of here and then run Claude again. Okay, so now if we do /MCP, we should see something here. And yeah, so here built-in MCPs, we can see Chrome DevTools MCP connected. Okay, so I actually recommend a first prompt of this URL. So let's copy that and go into Claude and paste that right here and see if it can do something with that. All right, so now it wants to actually call a tool from that. So it needs to go to a new page. All right, so here we go. Here it opens up its own window. I'm not controlling this. This is all done by Claude Code with the DevTools MCP server. And it wants to do something here, performance start trace. So it's going to do a performance trace. So let me put it side by side here. So it seems that this MCP server is focused a little bit more on the performance side of things. So here we get a performance report, looks good. And I want to know my own website for https://grad.com. So let's see, it first needs to go there. So it opens up a new tab, okay. And you can see here, Chrome is being controlled by automated test software, right? So this is I'm not doing anything here. Okay, so here we get a report again. So really interesting actually that it's able to do all of that here directly from Claude Code. All right, now there should be a new option here, which is auto connect. So then it shouldn't spin up its own window, but it should be able to reuse the window I already have open essentially. So let's see, we need to enable remote debugging in the Chrome instance. So if I open that up, I see this and I can allow remote debugging, okay? So now we need to add that auto connect option. All right, so actually, because I already installed the plugin before, I decided to install that first. So there's this command that I got from ChatGPT to uninstall it. And then there is a .mcp.json file, which is like a configuration file for MCP servers. So we already had the Shadcn MCP server from before, but now I'm adding this Chrome DevTools MCP server this way. And now here I can add that flag where auto connect is true. And so now if we go into Claude and if I do /MCP, I should still see this one. Yeah, so Chrome DevTools is still here. Okay. And now if I say something like open existing browser session and draw a rectangle in the Eraser app, right? So I'm using this Eraser app. I'm logged in here, right? So let's see if it can reuse this. I'm gonna just press enter and see what it can do with this. So we see one MCP server failed, but that's something else. That's from a different MCP server I was trying. All right, so here we go. It says allow remote debugging. So it asks me for permission. An external app wants full control over this Chrome session to debug it. This includes access to your saved data, cookies and site data, and the ability to navigate to any URL. Only web developers should turn on this feature and only use it with trusted apps, right? So you want to be a little bit careful with this. I'm going to allow it. And now we can see that it's being controlled by automated test software, and it wants to, and my Claude code now wants to call a tool. Okay, manage tabs. I'm gonna say yes. Okay, so actually this new window pops open. I'm not sure why that's the case. Select a page. Okay, so yes, I'll say that. It's already open. I already opened it myself, so that should be fine. Okay, it wants to take a screenshot. Right, so a very structured way, right? So it first picks the tab, then it's gonna take a screenshot so it can see the actions it can take in the UI. And now it says, I can see the eraser canvas. I'll select the rectangle tool and draw a rectangle on the canvas, okay? So it wants to press a key, and you can see it actually just switched, right? So here you can see now the rectangle tool is selected. I did not do that myself. It's all here from Claude. So drawing an actual shape on the canvas is quite advanced, I think. So if it doesn't do a great job on that, that's, you know, we'll give it a pass on that. Okay, so it wants to run some script here on the page. It may have drawn it somewhere. I don't want to zoom out. I don't want to interfere with it. Yeah, I think it's a little bit too advanced. I'll give it an easier task, like change the first text here into something else. From Figma MCP to testing this, right, just a random string here to see if it can change basically the text of this one into something else. So it needs to be able to select it. Let me actually just move it side by side. Okay, it wants to double click. All right, so I can see it's actually typing a new piece of text here. It actually is running into a bit of an issue here because it's basically an infinite canvas. I'm zoomed out here. I'm zoomed in here a little bit. So I think it has a bit of an issue with the coordinates. But you can see it was already able to add text here into this app that I'm logged into. So probably what I'm asking it to do is too advanced as a recording, but if you have simpler tasks that are not on an infinite canvas, it probably is able to do that. So pretty cool that it's able to do something here in apps that you're already logged in, the existing browser session. All right, so the next one, some kind of web access MCP. So I often have the situation where I'm building an app, but to properly solve some issue in the app, it does need to go out onto the internet and probably research a bunch of things. Just like if you're using ChatGPT thinking mode or like pro mode, it can go to all these different sites, do a bunch of research, and it comes back with a really good answer. Sometimes I need that for a coding task. So this is not just simply looking up recent docs with Context7. This is more broader web access. That's how I would categorize it. Now there's a bunch of services available for that. So recently actually I did a video on OpenClaw, and this is basically your personal AI assistant, which is also an agent. And this also needs to get access to the internet at some point. So they have the web search tool for that, and you can pick the provider for that. So actually they have a nice table. They actually have an interesting table here in the documentation showcasing some of the providers and information about each of them. So there is a Brave Search API. So there's actually a Brave Search MCP server. So you could use something like that. There's also Firecrawl. So that MCP server is most likely using the API here under the hood, and it will give your agent structured results with snippets. There's also Firecrawl Search. So Firecrawl also is quite a popular MCP server actually, mostly I think for scraping, but I guess also for just plain search. There's other providers as well like Gemini and Grok and Kimi. Perplexity has a search API as well, and we should be able to use that with their MCP server too. So there's a bunch of providers here. I've actually used the Bright Data MCP in the past. Bright Data has sponsored my channel, and they actually have a web access MCP as well. So there's a range of tools available. I would say this is more like a professional use case, or you want to scale it up. But there's a bunch of providers for that web access. I can't go through all of them. But typically in most setups, I think at some point you do want to have more general web access at some point as well for really optimal setup. All right, actually the next one is actually a bunch of other third-party services that you may already be using. For example, Vercel, or the service that you use to deploy apps, let's say. Right, so Vercel offers an MCP, and so I can give Claude access to my projects and deployments and analyze deployment logs. This can be really helpful because if you are deploying your app for the first time, let's say, there's typically a lot of issues that go wrong. There's a bunch of configuration that you typically have to clean up before the deployments go smoothly. So if you can say something to your agent, something like analyze why the deployment failed and fix the issues, it makes the whole deploying experience much smoother, right? It can because it has access to the errors and why it has failed. And your database provider may also offer an MCP server. So for example, Supabase here has an MCP server and it comes with some available tools. So your agent would then have access to the tables, listed tables, the database migrations, or even apply a migration, execute SQL queries. It can do debugging by getting the logs. And so it has, right? So actually this typically required a lot of manual work in their dashboard, right? Same with Vercel and a lot of these other services. You typically do not have to log into those dashboards as often as before because you can hand off these tasks to your agents as long as you set up their MCP server so they have access to it. But you can see there's a bunch of things that you can hand off to Claude Code or your other agents. And you may use some app like Notion to keep track of some docs or your ideas or some collaboration that you do with other people, your brainstorming. So Notion offers an MCP server as well. So you can create product requirement documents or specs in general, architecture docs, search. But actually what I think is really interesting with something like Notion, where you have a lot of ideas typically and requirements and docs. If you set up a Notion MCP and one of these design MCPs, let's say, you can then say something like to Claude Code, take the requirements document from Notion and create a design in paper. So now to maybe a design type of MCP, I'll manage for you with your AI agent. So when you're combining these MCPs, it actually unlocks some new workflows that could fit your situation very well. Of course, you also communicate a lot on some chat app, most likely. So if you're using Slack, it has an MCP server as well. So you could have maybe a thread on Slack where you're discussing how a particular feature should work. So then you can ask Claude Code, look up the thread where we discuss how the feature should work, right? So again, you do not, right? So then you don't have to manually go to Slack and look up a bunch of things. You can hand off more and more to your agent. And actually really underrated in my view is actually N8N for developers as well. So N8N is actually like a workflow builder. So you can have these nodes and drag them around on a canvas. And it allows you to very easily create pretty sophisticated workflows in a graphical user interface. So it's low code, so it's not typically something that developers deal with that much. But I've actually explored using this as a bit of like a backend for your app. So I actually have a video on Next.js and N8N. And previously it was maybe a little bit difficult to learn N8N, how these nodes work and such. But they have an MCP server. So with the MCP server, your agent can actually, well, the MCP server can at least help you out. It can look at the workflows, get information about it, and even trigger and run the workflows. There are some limitations as of recording, but it will help you out a lot if you can casually chat with your agent about how the workflow should be configured and what else you need to change. So it actually becomes a pretty realistic option as a developer that's not an N8N expert to actually perhaps try using it, right? And final example I'm going to give here is Linear, right? Or any other app, honestly, that you're using in some way in your workflows. You can just check if they have an MCP. They most likely have, right? So Linear has an MCP server as well if you're dealing with your tickets, your issues, if you're using it as your issue tracker. They actually have way more these days. So in general, I will take a look at the entire workflows that you have, and there's probably a bunch of MCP servers that you can connect to your agent to help you out in some way. And one of the biggest benefit in my view is that you do not have to log into and deal with all of these different dashboards. So I think the trend is that more and more can simply be done directly from the terminal with your agent, Claude, or your extensions here, the chat extensions. And yeah, it's way more comfortable in my view. All right, the final one I want to mention is actually your own MCP server. It's actually very easy to create them these days. Right, there's, for example, a TypeScript SDK to create them. A lot of hosting platforms allow you to host them as well. I actually have a video on adding an MCP server to your Next.js application. You can host it on Vercel in that case. So there may be some workflows or systems on your side, on your own side, not a third party, but in your own setup that you want to make available in some way to your coding agent. Right? Maybe you have some kind of admin panel or service and you want to do things through your agent instead of manually logging into an admin panel and clicking around in a dashboard. Right? So you may create an MCP server that exposes a tool called Create Customer Refund. Right? This also is helpful because you can be very deliberate and specific with the tools that you want to expose to your agent instead of a generic API server that Instead, you can have some limited set of tools in that MCP server and then just give access to that MCP server to the agent. So there are probably a bunch of conventions or collaborative workflows perhaps in your own setup that may benefit from having a dedicated MCP server that you connect to your agent. Now there's also something new called Web MCP. This is still being developed. This is now available in preview. So this is more meant if you have a website. You can imagine that a user goes to your website and they typically have an agent, an AI agent these days. So when the agent goes to your website, right, on the user's behalf, they need to fill out a form. Now the agent could try to interact with the UI by itself. It could try clicking around and filling out a form and submitting it, but it's probably a little bit more error prone than if you had if you're exposing a dedicated tool to that agent. If the user has an issue, they want to open up a support ticket, your website or app may expose a tool called create support ticket. And then the agent just calls that tool with the right parameters. So it's with the right arguments. So it's a more structured way for the agent to do actions on your website, right? Same with searching for a particular product, right? Yes, technically the agent could try to fill out some form or call some API endpoint, but a tool can be more structured, it's more deliberate, it's more focused on that actual interaction with the agent, right? So with Travel, you want to search, you want to filter results, you want to compare a bunch of data. Well, there may be some dedicated tools that provide a better way of doing that for the agent. Now, this is still being developed, and you may say, well, what's the difference between this Web MCP and just generally MCP? So typically an MCP is more like a server, and typically, very often it's a remote server. So there is a network round trip. With Web MCP, it's more instant. So it's on a live website. So it's faster, and the agent also has access to things that are going on in that browser tab. So if there are issues with the network tab, with network requests, for example, or maybe some script isn't working, the agent may actually be aware of that, can provide a better experience for the user because they simply have more information about the live context on a website. So I think this is also really interesting, but I think it has to be developed a little bit more. So we talked about all of these MCP servers, but of course, in the real world, we want to specify who should have access to those MCP servers and what kind of trust level there should be for these tools. And so now let's actually take a look at how we can add the new permit MCP Gateway to make all of this safer. So actually, I created a custom MCP server that exposes some tools. Just to quickly show you how I did that, it's actually very easy to create an MCP server these days. It's actually just a Next.js application, and you can just create a route handler here, and it's just /API/MCP. So there is this package here, create MCP handler, and it's just some dummy data in here. So there are some tickets. Okay, so there are some tickets here in an array and some documentation, so docs. So this MCP server exposes a tool called search the docs. So if my agent has access to that MCP server, it should be able to search the docs, right? So just an array with some dummy data. And there's the implementation here, and we have another tool creating a demo ticket. And here we have deleting a demo ticket, right? So just some tools here. I've deployed this to Vercel. So when you do that, you have actually created an MCP server that should be able to be accessed by your coding agent. Okay, now I do not directly want my coding agent to have access to this. I want to deal with the permissions. Okay, so I'm going to go to agent.security. You can find a link in the description. And here in the dashboard, I can set that up. Okay, so you typically want to start off by importing or creating the MCP server. Actually, I've already been playing around with the GitHub MCP server in here. So just to show you what you're going to get, you will see an overview here of the tools that Permit has detected coming from that MCP server. So that GitHub MCP server has a tool called update pull request, right? And there are tools like deleting a file. Now you can see this one has a trust level of high, meaning this is quite a risky tool. Permit automatically assigns some trust level, so you don't have to manually go through each one. It already does it for you. And I think it just looks at the title and the description of the tool, so it can get a pretty good sense of how dangerous the tool is. Typically, deleting data or updating data is a bit more dangerous because we're scared of losing data. And getting data is typically a little bit safer, relatively speaking. So you can see getting something here, get tag has, you need a low trust level to access this tool. right? So you get right? So if you import the MCP server here, you get an overview of the tools that it detects, and you can set the trust levels in a very fine-grained manner here, either yourself or just go with the default trust levels that it comes up with for you. So I could show that here for the GitHub, but actually I think your own MCP server is quite powerful, and especially in larger organizations, you have your own internal apps, you have your own internal services and workflows that could really benefit from that. So I want to show you it works with your own custom MCP servers as well. So here I have that URL, so it's just this one, and then it's living on /API/MCP. Okay, I will connect here. In the second step, we have some information here. Yeah, so here it can, and so then here it will also show you the tools that you can import. So remember, our requests should go through the gateway here. And so if you want the agent to not have access to, for example, searching, I can just deselect it and the agent shouldn't be able to use the tool. Okay, but if you do include a tool, you can then specify trust level that a user would need to actually invoke the tool. Right, by default, Permit comes up with some suggestions here, and actually they make sense, right? So deleting is the most dangerous, so you need high trust level. Creating something is medium, and just searching is low, okay? I will go ahead and import that server. All right, so we're gonna import it. All right, so import successful. I now have added this MCP server to my gateway. Let's check it out here on this page. So here on the page, you will see the tools again, so you can still change that later if you want. And here it shows you how to connect to this. So there is an option here for Claude code. I can just copy this. And just like before, I can go to my terminal here and I can run the MCP command here. I can run Claude. I can do /MCP. So here we now see another one. This is MCP TypeScript server on Vercel permit. So that's how I called it. And it needs authentication. So let's go there and click on authenticate. So you will go through an authentication flow here. And now we see a very interesting message here. It's either not available or we don't have access to it. And this is actually a good thing. It shows that not everybody can just access that MCP server. This user that I'm logged in as, this bytegrad@gmail.com user, needs actually to have access to this MCP server in the first place. So that's already something that we can do here. So here in the MCP page, there's also authorized humans. Right now, I have not authorized anybody to access it. So what we see is indeed correct. So here we're going to grant somebody access. I'm going to grant this user access. And then we can also pick the trust level for that user. So if I give this user medium trust access, it can it can use tools that have at most a medium trust level. So this user should not be able to do a high trust level tool, right? Like deleting something. So let's see if that works. So we're going to grant this user access, right? So let me actually re-authenticate here. So we'll MCP and we're going to go here and authenticate. And now here we should see, yeah. So now you can see a connection page here. So it actually gives more information here about the trust level. So it usually takes the low trust level for read-only tools like search and fetch. Medium is for read and write, like create and update, and high is for all tools, delete and admin actions. Okay, so we can actually specify the consent duration here as well, and also available tools. So we can see that actually because I was assigned here with a medium trust level, that I'm actually denied this delete demo ticket tool. Okay, so I will just leave everything here by default and approve. All right, so now after improving, I can see authentication successful, connected to that MCP server. Okay, so if I do MCP again, we can see that I am now connected to that one, but it's going through the permits gateway, right? So we can see in the URL here, this is agent.security here in the URL. If I click on view tools, we can see that there are 3 tools. Okay, so we have search demo docs. So let's actually try sending a message. Can you use the MCP server? I'm just being very explicit here just to make sure it actually invokes the MCP or attempts to do so, to search demo docs for AI or something like that, just to see if it works. All right, so here you can see now it wants to run a tool from that MCP server, search demo docs. It wants to call it with a argument called query and the value being AI. So I will always allow that here in the session. And it returned no matches. Okay, so it looks pretty good. Can you try creating a dummy ticket with the create demo ticket tool? Right, so if you want to know the tools, you can go back to the MCP server here in the dashboard. So we have 3 tools here and it wants to call the tool, looks good. And all of that looks very good. Let's also try deleting a demo ticket, right? So I should be denied now because I only have authorized the medium level access. Can you try deleting any demo ticket just to see if it works? All right, so here you can see it will attempt to call the delete demo ticket tool. So let's say I allow it on this side, and now we get an interesting issue. I am denied access. I do not have permission. You can see the delete was blocked with a permission denied error. This makes sense because it's a destructive tool, and it appears the MCP server has access controls that restrict deletion. Very important, especially if you work in a team or larger organization. You have a lot of sensitive data and a bunch of people, and it may get messy with these agents and MCP servers. People will try to access things. They will try to do things that they shouldn't really have permissions for. So really helpful that we can add this gateway here with permit, right? So I just need to make sure that the permissions are set up here. The trust levels are set up properly here. And so then if I try to do something like this that I should not be able to do, I'm going to be denied. And of course, we want to see a history of the things that happened. So we want to have an audit log. It actually integrates nicely here with the permit dashboard itself. So they're using the agent.security, but you can use your account from permit.io in case you already were using them for your policy, right? For your authorization logic, right? They have a policy decision point. And here in the audit log, I can see that there was an attempted action here on a particular resource that was denied, right? So this is still all the same fundamentals from the authorization logic that we talked about. There is some entity or user, right? In this case, an agent that is trying to do an action, this one, on a particular resource. And depending on the policy you have, that's either going to be denied or allowed. In this case, it was properly denied, and we have a trail of those decisions here, right? So the other ones were actually permitted, right? And there are other things that we can get access to here in Pro. So there are consent grants, immutable record of every consent decision, agent fingerprints track and identify agent clients connecting to your gateway by their unique fingerprints, right? So there may be multiple agents trying to connect to this gateway. Shadow agents, unknown, those are unknown agent clients trying to connect to your gateway. So if you're building out your MCP stack, make sure to check out agent.security by permit with the link in the description. So there you go. We have discussed what I think are the most interesting MCP examples and use cases right now. So I think if you take a look at your own workflows and the things that you're currently doing with your agents, then you'll probably find a few things from this list that could really help you out, save you some time, or just, it's more convenient. You don't have to log into a different dashboard. You can do it through your agent. And sometimes you actually discover a novel workflow where you can very easily bring data from Notion into maybe even GitHub repo, or take data from Figma and combine that with some other MCP server for new workflows. In any case, make sure to check out Permit's MCP Gateway if you're going to set up a bunch of MCP servers. You want to make sure that it's very clear who should have access to what, take care of the whole authorization aspect properly. So definitely check out the link in the description as well. In any case, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.